Today on Market Journal, have you made it out into the fields yet? Learn how weather conditions could impact harvest in the coming weeks. Plus, hear the benefits to planting winter-hardy cover crops and the types you might want to consider. And the cattle market is doing something that hasn't been seen in almost 3 years. Our livestock analyst is here to break it all down. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. It's our last show of September and hey, we're back in the studio for this week's broadcast as well. If you missed us last week when we were at Husker Harvest Days, make sure you check out that episode on our YouTube channel. Beginning today's broadcast, many corn and soybean producers eager to harvest will have to wait a bit longer. Monday's crop progress report showed that only 3% of Nebraska's corn crop is harvested. For soybeans, 55% of the crop was dropping leaves and no harvest numbers were reported. Now, if only the weather would cooperate. DTN Senior Ag Meteorologist Bryce Anderson joined me to discuss how weather this harvest season is shaping up.
Overall, this has been, I think, the toughest growing season since 2009 because of the big delay that we saw, and the worst of the delays turned out to be in the eastern corn belt. So there's a little bit of a have and have not thing going on with Nebraska producers being able to, I think, have a better time of it overall in getting crops in the ground. Farther to the east, they are still struggling. I mean, as we're visiting right now, the corn denting rate in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio and Michigan is still more than 30 points behind average, behind normal. Soybean pod set is still, pushing 10, 15 percentage points behind normal, again, in that eastern corn belt area. But in general, we're looking at a growing season that has offered the toughest situation since, in my opinion, 2009. And there's a little bit of a comparison to 13, but I think that 09, looking at harvest, is a better comparison.
All right, let's talk about harvest. As far as the weather goes, how are things shaping up?
Well, for the end of September, the rest of the month, it's looking quite favorable because we are in line to stay away from an early freeze, and that's good news for everybody. Temperatures, the balance of September, are likely to be above normal, and precipitation, in our view, is going to be below normal over most of the state. Now, in the Panhandle, northern Nebraska, there's going to be a more active precip pattern, and so we're looking at near to above normal over the western and the northern parts of the state. Central and east and southeast on a below normal track. October is getting to show more of a variable pattern when it comes to temperatures, and I think more near normal during October, the farther we get into the fall season. And the precipitation signal is looking above normal for Nebraska, for the entire state. Now this is going to slow down harvest because I know that there are a lot of growers who are pretty much in line of wanting to get going in that first part of October. So October could be a bit of a problem with some disruptions, and then November turns back to a warmer and drier signal, so that would help out. And I do think that we're going to have some delays in October. I don't think that we are in line for that to be a problem on the order of what we saw a year ago, because a year ago it was just wet, and we had a chronically delayed harvest.
Dropping down to South America for a minute, as we're ramping down, they're starting to ramp up. What do you see for planting when it comes to Brazil and Argentina?
Well, looking at the situation for getting going on planting, I think that Brazil is going to see a bit of a delay. Right now, the central part of Brazil, Mato Grosso, the biggest soybean producing state, is looking pretty much hot and dry. It doesn't look like their dry season is going to end in an earlier time frame than typical. So I don't think that they're going to be able to get going on soybean planting right away. Now, when they do get planted, our thought is that the weather pattern is going to be, pretty much near average for Mato Grosso and for the largest soybean production states. But so much depends on the timing of the soybean planting, because 2 years ago we saw Brazil being dry, the soybean planting delayed until into November for the beginning. Harvest was late, and that led to a later start in planting their second crop corn, safrinha, which meant that a lot of that crop 2 years ago pollinated after the dry season returned, and their production dropped quite a bit. And we saw the benefit of that, so to speak, because there was a bigger world market for U.S. corn during the spring 2 years ago.
And Bryce, as we look at our winter weather forecast, still down the line a little bit, forecasts aren't going to be completely accurate since it's still so far off, but what are you seeing in the long-range models?
Our look is that winter is going to be a fairly mild winter, actually. We are not looking for a real outbreak of big-time cold during the winter season. The Pacific Ocean, even at more of a northern latitude area, is looking warm, and that should lead to a milder outlook for us when it comes to those winter temperatures and kind of staying away from a real snowy pattern during the next winter season.
Bryce also tells us that ocean temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic remain above average. He says he'll be watching for any tropical systems that could impact harvest and late season crop conditions. And stick around, Al Dutcher will be here with his full forecast later in the show. Moving on, and we've told you before how UNL researchers are constantly trying to learn more about the potential benefits or impacts of cover crops on various crop rotations. At a recent soil management field day, Nebraska NRCS State Soil Health Specialist Aaron Hurd told me he too is getting lots of questions about cover crops and the best ways to utilize them.
There's different options in some cropping systems. Wheat, we're standing here by a wheat field, and that of course has been harvested and the cover crop planted. That's a really phenomenal opportunity to grow a cover crop that's a frost kill cover crop. And frost kill cover crops are those that terminate with frost and then alleviates the need to kill those in the spring. That's a big deal because we can potentially save some herbicide costs in that treatment, but we have something there that's competing against fall annual weeds, and spring annual weeds are then covered up by a heavy residue.
And as for timing, Aaron says there's still room to get the cover crops seeded in.
Between September 15th and October 15th, there's another window of opportunity to plant some winter hardy cover crops, those that will survive the winter. And then after that, we really do need to wait for dormancy. And after November 15th, we can continue on planting in sort of a dormant season planting that will then germinate in the spring. So as we move out of the warm season, we're going to get away from our warm season legumes and grasses and more into our spring and winter annuals like oats and rye and barley and triticale are some grasses and vetches and turnips and radishes. Some of the brassicas, collards and common rapeseed are all options there in September to October. And really after November 15th, we're going to be down to cereal rye, sweet clover, and some clovers, other clovers that might be suitable, some vetches that might also then survive the winter and germinate in the spring.
Aaron also says applying cover crops to no-till systems has shown positive outcomes in water infiltration, weed suppression, and nitrogen scavenging. We'll take a break from harvest and cover crops now for a look at the livestock markets. The September cattle on feed report has been released, and feedlot inventories are showing the first year-over-year decrease in 33 months. Our expert weighs in on what could be behind it. Also, African swine fever has gotten so bad in China that some cities are tapping into their emergency supplies of pork. We'll have an update on the outbreak. And the quarterly grain stocks report is just days away. Our analyst has a preview. Dr. Scott Brown is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the University of Missouri's College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources. And we always love to hear what he has to say with what's going on in agriculture. Scott, thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on today, Troy.
And Scott, I'd like to begin with the September cattle on feed report. When you were reading through the numbers, what stuck out to you?
Well, I think out of the gate, the thing that stuck out to me was when you look at the placement numbers, 91% of a year ago in terms of August placements. That certainly surprised many in the marketplace from a pre-report standpoint, and suggest at least smaller numbers placed in August. And you, on top of that, look at cattle on feed as of the beginning of the month, and we were actually down for the first time about 1.3% relative to a year ago. That's the first decline we've seen since December of 2016, so it's been a while since we've talked about a smaller inventory of on-feed.
So how much of this report was a reaction to last month's Tyson beef plant fire?
So I certainly think producers are making some decisions relative to the prices they've seen since that fire. As we know, cattle prices have generally been moving lower since then. I always go, to me it's a combination of a couple of factors that I think have been at play that maybe have at least pushed some of these calves further down the road in terms of entering the feedlot. The lower prices that, again, partially I believe are the result of what we've seen with the loss of capacity. But also I think you found a lot of producers with more available grass supplies than they've seen for a while. So it was easier maybe to say, I'm going to keep those calves for another month or another couple of months just to see what happens a little bit further post all of the issues with lower prices that we saw once we saw that fire.
So since we are past Labor Day, now officially into fall, the time of year when beef demand does start to slow down, what would you like to see this last quarter of 2019, or maybe even as we get into the first quarter of next year?
Well, so I think you hit the nail on the head. The demand's really going to be critical, and domestic demand is a big part of that. You know, as I look at where markets are today, and you're correct that we tend to see seasonally some loss of demand on the beef side of things. Yet when you look at the choice box beef price that we've seen recently, we're still about 12 cents above where we were a year ago at this time. So we've frankly seen higher quality beef products from a price standpoint that have been at very nice levels. I think the flip side of that, when you look at select beef, we're about 2 cents below where we were a year ago at this time. It keeps reminding me that consumers have certainly been suggesting with their pocketbooks and what they're willing to pay, that they're willing to pay more for that higher quality beef. And I think as the industry, we need to continue to stay focused on that front.
All right, Scott, want to switch to hogs and get an update on the big news that we're still talking about, African swine fever. So if you could you give us the latest on where this disease has spread and how hog numbers are looking internationally?
Yeah, so if you look at African swine fever, it continues to be an issue in a number of those Asian countries, with South Korea recently, I believe, talking about a fourth case now. Cases in the Philippines, I believe we now see it in Manila. It just reminds us that this is going to be a very difficult disease to get under control. It's going to mean a loss of production in some traditional pork-producing countries around the world. The exact effects get really hard to determine. I keep saying this is a 0-1 kind of outcome. We tend to be heading towards the 1, though, of it's going to be a pretty big event. And it's more the loss of production. You look in a country like China, hog prices are moving dramatically higher. I'm wondering at the end of the day whether we just see reduced domestic consumption in China as much as we see growth in imports from other countries, and United States in particular. To me, when I look at hog markets, we have a lot of excitement about the potential to be able to trade more pork with China. yet it's an on again, off again kind of relationship that's developed.
Definitely continue to follow that. And also important to mention the quarterly grain stocks report. That's going to be released on Monday. What do we need to look for in this report?
Yeah, so we'll get some final numbers in terms of what we went out of the 18-19 crop year with in terms of stocks. I'm not sure that there's too much that worries me. I guess on the soybean side of the equation, when you saw USDA go from the August WASDE report to the September report, they were reducing soybean ending stocks. If those quarterly stock numbers actually suggest we had more stocks of soybeans on hand, I'm sure that will be a little bit of drag on soybean prices. I'm not sure that we can get much of a bounce on the positive side with what might be lower than expected stocks of corn and soybeans as we continue to stay focused on ultimately yields and production. But big report in terms of getting out of last year's crop year with just how big stocks are. You know, anecdotally, I'll keep hearing producers who will suggest they've got a lot of old crop corn that they haven't moved yet. If that's true, I think all of that continues to keep a lid on any large increases in corn prices.
Dr. Scott Brown, pleasure as always. Appreciate you joining us today.
Hey, you bet, Troy. Glad to be on.
Next up, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center is well known as one of the only places in the U.S., if not the world, with a spider cam used for collecting crop phenotype information in the field. The field phenotyping facility near Meade is home to 4 90-foot-tall poles, each connected to a cable that helps hoist a dolly carrying a spider cam and other sensors used to collect phenotypic data on corn and soybeans. This summer, there was a new piece of autonomous technology traversing the field, the FlexRow, short for Flexible Robot. Read about the autonomous machine built by UNL's Biological Systems Engineering Department in the September Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Hope your fall is off to a good start, Al. Give us an idea of what we can expect for the forecast as October begins.
Well, Troy, we are ending October, and unfortunately it's going to look like the lion is entering the month. We're going to have a very strong storm system to deal with in the northern plains and some very cool conditions for this time of the year. We've been pretty much dominated by warm conditions for much of the month of September, and we're finally starting to get a taste of this cool weather this week. We get a little reprieve as we get into Sunday and Monday, but then things fall apart rather rapidly as we get into the middle of next week. If we go to the upper air pattern, what we will notice is a big, large upper air low. We talked about this the last couple of weeks, that there was some chance for cool weather. This big upper air low is going to pivot toward the northern plains over the next few days. And at the surface, we're going to see a low pressure system develop in southern Nevada. That's going to help to steer moisture up towards the northern plains. So you start to see the breakout of precipitation today will be over the northern Rockies and a little bit here in southeast Nebraska that will fill in during the afternoon and evening hours. Tomorrow, that low pressure makes a little bit quicker advance to Nebraska. Low pressure at the surface develops in the panhandle of Nebraska. Widespread precipitation to our north. The cold front that blows through the state kind of hangs up to our southeast, so we do have an area of heavy precipitation possible extreme southeastern Nebraska. And we see high pressure starting to push in toward the south on Monday. But we will get a reprieve here in Nebraska as we start to see some warm air come into our region with a little bit of precipitation expected in the southeast, but highs may make it back up into the mid to upper 80s south, 80s low 80s north, and then on Tuesday the low starts to pivot out a little bit farther. We're still going to see some warmer temperatures in southeast Nebraska, probably in the mid 80s, but the cool conditions start to invade the northwestern part of the state, and heavy precipitation starts to focus along the front as this front basically stags out and most of the cold air moves toward the Great Lakes. So by the time we get to Wednesday, high pressure firmly in control. We do expect frost conditions across Montana and North Dakota, possibly making it as far southward as South Dakota. And then we'll see that major precipitation start to push off a little bit farther to the east. And then on Thursday, we start to see that ridging taking place. So most of the cold air associated on Thursday morning will be over eastern portions of the Dakotas and Minnesota. And then that freezing temperatures will move over toward the Great Lakes region as we get on the day on Friday. And then the main pivot of precipitation moves back toward the south. And on Friday, we start to see the rebound in temperatures. And yet another low starts to move its way into the southwest with low pressure developing in southern Nevada. We'll wait to see how this system acts and if it takes a similar path. But right now, the first wave of precipitation is expected to move in an easterly fashion toward the Texas Panhandle. We look a little farther into the future, the 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday does show below normal temperatures, but primarily because of the system that will be involved on Wednesday and Thursday. And then as we go a little bit farther in terms of precipitation, we see this heavy axis of precipitation. And once again, the vast majority of this precipitation shown during this period is associated with the system coming out on Wednesday and Thursday. And once that passes the south coast, we should see some fairly dry weather. So overall, things do look rather nasty in terms of harvest activity, particularly eastern 1/3 of the state and northern Nebraska. We may see some dry sliding occurring in southwest and southeast or south central Nebraska, and overall precipitation during the 7-day period is forecasted to be anywhere from 1 to 2 inches in the southeast to upwards of 5 inches over central portions of Iowa. So a little shift toward the north in terms of this pattern, and we could see some exceptionally heavy precipitation in southern Nebraska. So Troy, overall, looks like fall is here, and we're getting our first good taste of classic fall weather.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, sorghum has the capacity to grow more efficiently than corn in the west and high plains, where irrigation is a harder commodity to come by than the land to grow it on. However, maximizing the crop's potential for biofuel production has proven to be a challenge. Market Journal's Bill Dodd recently caught up with UNL Associate Professor Dr. James Schnable to get an inside look at how his team is trying to overcome those challenges through genetics. Bill, tell us what you've got your eye on this week.
Thanks, Troy. Sorghum is a very efficient plant when it comes to water consumption, heat resistance, and low seed cost. In fact, the team at UNL, in conjunction with several other universities, are utilizing a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy in order to crack the genetic code of sorghum in order to maximize its potential for biofuel. Sorghum is our nation's third most plentiful cereal crop and could potentially be a key player in the biofuels industry. However, there are challenges involved in making sorghum a viable candidate to be a key crop in biofuel production. The biggest key to doing so is to pinpoint the functionality of some of sorghum's roughly 30,000 genes. Enter James Schnable, Associate Professor of Agronomy and Horticulture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The team he has put in place are currently working to crack the genetic code in sorghum with the use of a $2.7 million 3-year grant from the U.S. Department of Energy to develop an efficient method for characterizing the functions of genes in sorghum.
So sorghum actually already has a lot of advantages when you look at it as a biofuel crop, which is one of the reasons DOE put so much funding into supporting it. So DOE and all of us should be very concerned about biofuels driving up the cost of the food we eat every day. Sorghum is able to grow on more marginal land where it's not competing with corn. It's able to grow in areas with less water. It's able to grow in areas with high heat stress. So the goal with most biofuels crops is to be able to grow on this marginal land that either is not being used for crop production right now or is being used for crop production with extremely low yields. So my research overall focuses a lot on linking variation in the genome to variation in phenotype or in traits in both corn and sorghum. This particular grant from the Department of Energy is focused on developing new methods for figuring out which of the 30,000 genes in sorghum we should focus on using a combination of machine learning and crop modeling.
In the greenhouses at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Innovation Campus, master's student Mackenzie Swiner tends to the research plants. They're watered 2 times a week, with half the plants being analyzed for phenotypic changes over the course of treatment, while the others are sampled at the V5 stage for delivery to Hudson Alpha in Alabama for RNA extraction. Here, the team is relying on reverse genetics to understand the details about how plants perceive and react to their environments in order to develop varieties tailored to grow in varying climates and conditions around the country. Now, like me, you may be wondering, what exactly is reverse genetics, and how is that applied to sorghum?
So reverse genetics is a fancy word, but essentially it's the geneticist's way of figuring out what an individual gene does. This will be very familiar to anyone who has tried to figure out how an engine or any complex piece of machinery works. You break something and you see what happens. So reverse genetics is you pick one gene, you break that gene, and you see how it affects the traits and the phenotype of the resulting plant. A lot of this process will just use natural genetic variation, but ultimately to figure out whether we're right about the function of a gene, we do have to go in and break that gene. To do that, we use a process called genome editing, which uses a protein called Cas9 to go in and make a targeted break in the DNA.
Schnabel's team isn't alone in their venture. A project this big requires a bit of outside assistance. As it happens, James says he feels very fortunate that he's been able to orchestrate a team of institutions from across the Corn Belt to create an innovative merger of expertise that is in turn creating a systemic method for selecting which genes it makes sense to investigate.
So yeah, I was fortunate to be able to put together a really skilled team at a bunch of different institutions. So we've got a statistician at Iowa State, a guy working with satellite data at the University of Illinois, a fellow developing new hyperspectral sensors for measuring the composition of plants without damaging them at Purdue University, 2 scientists at Michigan State, including another maize biologist, as well as a woman who analyzes drone data to make measurements of sorghum plants from flying UAVs over fields. And it was really important to be able to pull together this team because a lot of the research we're doing in this grant requires sets of expertise that really haven't existed in one field or one discipline or one department before.
The implications of this research go far beyond making sorghum a viable option for biofuel production. In fact, by the year 2050, our planet's population is on pace to top 9.7 billion inhabitants. Well, this could put a strain on the world's food supply, and if successful, the applications of this research could extend to other crops, making it possible to grow food in regions that have historically had unsuitable climates to sustain meaningful crop development.
Plants have between, say, 20 and 40,000 genes in their genome, but only a very small number of those genes, say a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand, have actually been characterized to the point where we know what that gene does in terms of how it affects the traits of the organism in different environments. So what we're doing here in sorghum is trying to develop this method by, using machine learning and crop modeling to figure out which genes it makes sense to focus our research efforts on. If it works in sorghum, I have a lot of confidence that it will also work in corn. The 2 species are very closely related. It will probably also work in even more distantly related species like wheat or soybeans or rice.
This endeavor is the first of its kind to couple artificial intelligence and plant science. Schnable says that this combination has started gaining more momentum in the past year and a half, and with this new innovation taking off with researchers, we can expect to see this method open doors to new opportunities in plant genetics for years to come. And Troy, that's what I got my eye on this week. For now, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Really amazing work the team is doing over there. That's going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, you can download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, we'll get a check on harvest and the markets with Doug Simon, plus learn some ways to prepare your grain bins so the insects stay out, but the crop stays safe. All that and so much more. We'll see you next week. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.